Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Thanks to all of you who've been following me on Twitter and YouTube and LinkedIn on these videos. I really appreciate you paying attention and providing the feedback you have so far. So that's been great. We're starting to build a little bit of a community of content here. Today I want to talk about one of the platforms we've been working on, the Categorize High School Sports. We've been talking about this interesting concept that we've been labeling sort of social versus technical constraints on the project. This is, of course, a product. We're trying to take it to market as quickly as we can, and in a way where we want to, like we've talked about in previous videos, we have hypotheses. We want to validate those, and we want to do that using data from our customers. And so one of the things we want to do is to simplify some of the features that we're implementing, specifically the technical constraints on those. The way we're doing that is we're trying to pick our heads up and start to understand some social cues on the right way to impose constraints on users. And ultimately, before I get into the example, I think one of the benefits this gives us is it returns some of the power to the customer, the end user who gets to kind of do things their own way. And so we don't necessarily have technology who are constraining the inputs that we're giving into our application. It's more of a societal thing. The example I want to talk about is interesting because we were getting into, so again, targeting high school sports. There's a hierarchy here. You have conferences and divisions, and then schools within state associations, and there's this fairly complex hierarchy. And within the system, we were thinking about how to model that and how to model changes going forward. And one of the decisions we made is we're going to continue to allow. We basically flattened out that hierarchy for the platform that we're talking about, in lieu of creating this hierarchy of school association, conference, division, school, or whatever it ends up being, which actually might differ by state. We're actually going to go with more of a flat structure, which I think enables the user, first of all, to create their own way of doing things and doing it via nomenclature as opposed to technical constraints of, well, this school can only be in this division, for example, within this sport. So in this case, we're looking to society to provide some of the controls over how it should work as opposed to using it as strictly a technical limitation. Drawbacks of that, of course, less validation. So the way we'll end up doing this is you're going to have a season within those sports are going to be named after the sports, and then Division 1, Division 2 maybe, for example, as opposed to having that purely hierarchical. Now you're having there's less validation from the system itself, so there's more of the odds are better that something I don't want to say goes wrong. I think that's a strong way of putting it, but it doesn't exactly match up with how we intend the hierarchy to look. But the benefits, I think, end up being lower implementation investment. So we're making an assumption that some of these constructs are very important. Maybe they're not, and I think that's something we want our users to actually give us through feedback as opposed to making those assumptions. It does provide a lot more control back to the user. They can kind of make it their own, which I think is an interesting concept. Again, looking to them to be the curators of that system. Now, of course, we're in the benefit of we're working directly with a let's call it a moderation type of user, which not applications have the luxury of doing. So if all you have is users and there's not much of a moderation concern, you're in a little bit different place. But I would suggest take a look at what you have available to you, and if there's anything that you can use from actual society, people working directly with each other to institute and govern those rules, maybe that's a time where you can step back and not spend so much time on implementation and think more about the end experience. But ultimately, we're driving increased flexibility for learning when we're validating our assumptions here. It's been a really interesting topic for the team because we're starting to learn where we can not take shortcuts, but where we can decrease our investment up front. We could form hypotheses on how we think it's going to work, but then we've also implemented methods for our users to provide direct feedback. So if it does become a problem, if we're seeing that there's too many issues with the way we're doing it, then we can always change that down the road via iteration. But I want to do that based on actual feedback we're receiving, as opposed to some of our guesses that we're making somewhat in a vacuum. Educated guesses, sure, but we want to make sure that the users are actually using that before we provide more investment into what we're doing. Anyway, interesting to us, something to think about. Is your app existing in society where you have the potential to engage with your users at different levels to provide their own governance? In which case, maybe it makes a little more sense to keep your system flexible and make sure you're not locking things down before you actually know that it's useful.